The rig uses many pieces of equipment to circulate and treat or condition the mud. Mud circulation begins here, in the mud tanks, sometimes called the pits. Crew members prepare the mud in these tanks and make it ready for circulation. The heart of the circulating system is the mud pump. Often, rigs have two pumps, one primary pump and one for backup. Or, if hole conditions require it, the driller can compound or combine the two pumps to circulate large volumes of mud. In fact, on deep wells, the rig may have 3 or 4 compound pumps. The powerful pump or pumps pick up mud from the mud tanks and send it to the drill string and bit. The pump moves the mud into the discharge line, up the standpipe, and into the rotary hose. The standpipe takes the mud about halfway up the mast. The rotary hose is attached to the standpipe. The rotary hose is strong, flexible hose that moves with a swivel as it goes up and down in the mast. From the rotary hose, the pump moves mud through the swivel and then down the kelly and drill string. On rigs with a top drive, the mud moves through a passage in the top drive and then into the drill string. The pump moves the mud down the drill string to the bit. At the bit, the mud jets out of the openings or nozzles in the bit. The jets of mud move cuttings away from the bit. Mud then continues up the annulus, carrying the cuttings with it. From the annulus, the mud with the cuttings in it goes through the return line, sometimes called the flow line, to the shale shaker. The shale shaker removes the cuttings from the mud. The mud then falls into the mud tanks, where the mud pump can pick it up and continue the circulation process. Mud is made up at the rig location. Most rigs have several steel mud tanks. Mud and additives are mixed and held in the tanks. Some land rigs also have a reserve pit dug out of the ground. Mud tanks are also called mud pits, a carryover from the days of earthen pits. Mud tank is the preferred term. The rig does not necessarily use all the mud tanks at once, although it does use several. The active tanks hold mud the pump actively circulates. Often, mud components come to the rig in sacks. Normally, the crew stores the sacks in a special compartment called the mud house or sack room. The house or room keeps the sacks dry and allows them to be stored with care. These silo-like tanks are bulk tanks or P-tanks. They hold mud additives like barite and bentonite. Crew members use some additives in such large quantities that suppliers load them into the bulk tanks to save time and money. Bulk tanks usually have their own hopper or pneumatic system for transferring the additives to the mud system. The pump takes the mud out of the active mud tanks and circulates it through the system. Crew members connect the mud tanks with the piping and manifolds. The number of active mud tanks depends on the amount of mud needed to keep the hole full, and the volume required on the surface to keep the mud in good condition for circulating. The sand trap is the tank directly below the shale shaker. The shale shaker removes most of the cuttings from the mud, but some are so small the shaker cannot trap them. These fall into the sand trap. The sand trap is the first settling tank. Crew members have to clean it regularly to remove the built-up solids. Some small or old rigs may have 2 or more settling tanks in the tank system. They allow solids in the mud to settle out, but settling tanks do not do a very good job as compared with newer generation solids removal equipment. So, today, most rigs use a desander and desilter. Reserve tanks are not a part of the active mud tank system. Instead, the crew uses them to hold excess mud. Or they may use them to mix a different type of mud than the pump is currently circulating. They may also store heavy mud for emergency well control operations. A slug tank is a relatively small separate tank, or it may be a small separate part of a larger tank. The crew uses the slug tank to mix a slug. A slug is a small amount of heavy mud that is pumped down the string. Crew members may also use a slug tank to mix a small amount of mud for a special purpose. For example, the driller may need to place or spot a small quantity of high viscosity mud, also called a pill, at some point downhole. The suction tank is where the mud pump picks up mud ready to circulate downhole. Mud in the suction tank should be clean, free of solids and gas, and be properly formulated or conditioned. Crew members use the chemical tank to mix special chemicals, such as caustic, that they will put into the active mud tanks. On some land rigs, the rig owner digs a large pit next to the rig. This pit is called the reserve pit. The crew puts waste mud and runoff from the rig site in the reserve pit. In an emergency, they can also use it as a place to put more mud than the tanks can hold. Often, the rig operator lines the reserve pit with a thick plastic sheet to prevent liquids from leaching into the soil. And, if the rig is on a migratory bird flyway, the operator covers it with netting to keep the waterfowl from landing in it. Land rigs drilling in environmentally sensitive areas will not have a reserve pit. Instead, wastes and runoff are hauled to an approved waste disposal area.